So I'm going to do the next 2 sessions so that I know. No. This is really good because after lunch is the time that you take your nap. So you get to sleep through my sessions. You get to be awake for Paul's at the end, and then Paul and Dave tomorrow. And it's well, Dave will be after lunch tomorrow, but it's okay, So I'll take these next 2 sessions, and then you'll get to listen to these other guys for the rest of the conference today and tomorrow. So in session 3, we are going to be talking about the biblical storyline. And one of the dangers of studying the Bible too deeply, and by deeply I mean like word studies and exegeting specific passages and stuff, is that we can forget how that passage or that word, like Dave was talking about, specific words and specific contexts and stuff. One of the dangers of doing that is that we can forget how it connects to the bigger timeline, the bigger storyline, right? And we can really get into a lot of trouble if we focus down so narrowly and pick out one verse or one passage or one topic and build an entire doctrine around that if we don't connect it to the bigger picture. And so, honestly, as you look back through church history, nearly every heresy, every aberrant theology, everything that goes against Christian orthodoxy is because of either a complete misunderstanding of what the text is talking about or a misinterpretation of the text because we didn't connect it to the big context, the big picture, taking it out of its context. And so one of the great examples that we're going to be talking about, I mentioned it in the first session, and Paul's going to be spending a lot of time on it, is the question, is Jesus reigning in the kingdom right now? Is Jesus ruling in his kingdom right now? Well, a lot of people will say yes, because he ascended, and according to the book of Hebrews, what did he do? He ascended and he sat down where? At the right hand of, not just the right hand of God, there's a phrase in there, the right hand of the throne of God. Okay, he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Well, Psalm 110 says that Jesus is going to be, or Messiah is going to be ruling from a throne. He's going to be given a throne. Luke chapter 1 says that Jesus is going to be given a throne. So that means if Jesus ascended and he's sitting at the right hand of the throne of God right now, and Messiah is supposed to be getting a throne, all we have to do is put those together and say he's ruling from the throne right now, right? And a lot of people would say, yes, that's true. But is it possible that there's more than one throne? Is it possible that the throne that the Father is sitting on, that Jesus is at the right hand of, is not the same throne that he will himself be sitting on at some point? If all we do is we take the word throne and we just throw all the times together that we see throne and make it the same thing, we can really misunderstand because we don't connect it to the context. Another one, I teach the book of Hebrews in Hungary, and I've taught it here before, and there are some really stiff warning passages, including one in Hebrews chapter 10 that says that if a believer continues, or a person continues to sin, go on sinning, keep on sinning willfully, he will face the fire that consumes God's enemies. Well, if it consumes God's enemies, that means that the believer can lose his salvation, right? Is it possible that God's fire can do more than one thing? Is it possible that God's holy fire doesn't just consume enemies, but it actually can do other things as well? Like, for instance, in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where it says that the person who is a believer in Christ will stand before Jesus, and his works will go through God's holy fire, And some will be consumed and some will be purified, but he himself will be saved, even as through fire. So, does the fire that consumes, can it also purify? Yes. And so, some people look at throne and say, well, it's all the same throne, so therefore Jesus must be reigning now. Some people look at fire and say, well, it's always judgment fire or hell fire, so that means Christians can go to hell or be judged. We have to be careful to connect the entire story, the big picture, as we go through this. So, while we have to do this exegetical stuff, while we have to do the word studies, while we have to do all these things, it's important that we make sure that we connect them to the big picture. So, some of you have heard me use the illustration before of the forest and the trees. I really like this type of Bible study. I love this type of Bible study. You get down and you look at the leaves and the different parts of the leaves and the bark and all of that really cool detail. I didn't even know there were this many oak trees. Did you? These are all different oak tree leaves. Did you know that? Like, I'm familiar with this one and maybe this one. And I've heard of a bur oak, but I didn't realize it had a different leaf. And I've heard of a white oak, and I didn't know it had a different leaf. I've never heard of a swamp white oak. I've heard of a red oak. I didn't realize it had a different. Oak trees are everywhere. Oak trees are awesome. If all we did was pick up a bunch of these leaves and look at all these and find out that they're all from different types of oaks, we would think that there's only oak trees in this area, right? Because all we're doing was looking at these little details. Sometimes we have to get in the helicopter and sort of zoom up above and find out that there's a whole forest of different types of trees. And we have to see where the boundaries are, the forest stays within. And yes, we could zoom down on the specific leaves, and we should, so that we can look at the elms and the pines as well as the oaks and the ash and all of the other stuff. But if all we did was look at the leaves, we would have a very narrow view of this big forest, wouldn't we? So it's important to do both the really detailed stuff and the big picture stuff. And we call the big picture stuff Bible surveys. And there are a couple of different ways to do Bible surveys. I'm just going to throw a couple of them at you, and then we'll focus on one of them. One way to do a Bible survey is to do chronological. And so you start in Genesis 1, and you survey the Bible, and you go all the way through to Revelation 22. The Bible is generally chronological, and I say generally because, Genesis is the beginning of everything, and Revelation is the end of everything, and everything else is in between. So that's chronological, right? So that's one way to do it. It does tell a story. There are 11 books of the Old Testament that actually carry the story forward, and the rest of them supplement. If all you had was Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, Ezra, and Nehemiah, you would have the entire chronology of the Old Testament. It's 11 out of 39. The other 28 books fit inside those. When you get to the New Testament, what tells the chronology? What pushes the timeline of the New Testament? There's 27 books. How many do you need to push the timeline? Okay, Paul says 2, you say 3. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John really count as one because it's the same story, right? So that's one. Where else is there any kind of chronology? You get the Acts, okay, and the Revelation, right? The Revelation, that tells future chronology. The Acts tells what was in the early church is about 30 years worth or so. All the rest of them are letters, and they may give details here and there, but they're not really pushing the story forward, are they? So you can actually see the entire chronology of the whole Bible in about 14 books out of 66. Isn't that interesting? And you can survey, just take this big overarching view that way. And the problem with the chronological type of study is that it's like a movie. The Bible's like a movie or a TV show. So you're watching it and you expect things to be moving in this direction, and then they do a flashback. So now I'm adding information that really goes back here. And then they're telling a story here, and then they tell another story here, but they actually happened at the same time, right? Because you can't, unless you had picture-in-picture or they, did them at the same time. You can't tell in a movie or a TV 2 stories simultaneously. Well, you can't do that in print either. So you're reading through it, and then you read something else that was happening at the same time. And so there's overlap, and there's flashbacks, and there's flash forwards, and all this stuff going on. And sometimes a chronological study can be really difficult as you're going through the Bible, trying to keep things straight. Well, another way to do this is a topical study. You can take a topic and survey the entire Bible. One way to do this is in the genealogies, and this is especially true in the Old Testament. The Jewish people love their genealogies, primarily because it's the families that are given tracts of land in the Promised Land, right? And so if you know your genealogy, if you can trace back in your family tree, you can trace back to the Promised Land. You can look at lives of certain individuals, the life of David, the life of Jesus, the life of Moses, that sort of thing, the life of Paul. Of course, there's the redemptive plan. And as much as I made a big deal about the fact that the redemptive plan is not the center of the Bible, it's still in there, isn't it? You see the story of salvation all the way back in Genesis chapter 3 when God promised that there would be somebody coming, a redeemer coming to crush the serpent, right? And we see the story as God worked all the way through. I'm not saying that the redemptive plan is not in there. I'm just saying that it's not the big story. It's not the center story. God's glory is the center story. Back on genealogies for just a second, I took this picture when we were in Europe. We went to Munich, and in 1972, you remember what happened at the 1972 Olympics in Munich? The terrorists attacked the Israeli Olympians, and 11 Israelis were killed. Well, this is one of the memorials that was there, in fact, right at the apartment building. And they've got, on the left side, they've got the list of names of each of the Israelis who were killed in English letters, I guess. On the other side, they've got the Hebrew names. And what's really interesting, if you notice, each one of these names on the left has only 2 words, right? There's a first and a last, a Christian name, surname, first name, last name, whatever. On the right side, every single one of them has 4 words. And if you'll notice, the second word, you don't even have to be able to read Hebrew, and you can tell if you're working from the right to the left, the second word all the way down is the same word. You see how the shapes are the same? Okay, that word is ben. And in Hebrew, that means son of. And so we don't see it in the English names, but in the Hebrew names on the right-hand side here, every single one of these names includes in the middle son of whatever his father's name was. So on the left, the one I've got highlighted is David Berger. On the right, it says David, son of Benjamin Berger. Their genealogies matter. And you can trace the genealogies back through their father's name. And I just thought that was really cool when I saw that on there. I'm like, see, this connects to how we study the Bible and the genealogies. And every single one of these names, you can tell their father's names if you can read Hebrew. So another way to do a Bible survey, again, we're looking at the whole big storyline, is by looking at the covenants and the dispensations. And that's the one that we're going to focus on in this session, is the covenants and the dispensations. Now, we're actually going to spend more time on dispensations because 4 out of the 6 covenants I'm going to tackle in more detail in the next session. So we need to introduce them here. So here's our question. So let's start with covenants. What is a covenant? A covenant is a formal legal agreement made between at least 2 parties where at least one of the parties has a responsibility or an obligation to keep. And that is in your notes, but I want to highlight 3 different phrases here. First of all, it's a formal legal agreement. That means that it's binding on both parties, okay? That means it is a binding agreement. we would use a term, today, we don't use covenant quite as often. What term do we usually use today? Contract, okay? A covenant, when you read a covenant in the Bible, think contract. It's a legally binding contract between at least two parties, and there can be more. At least one of the parties has an obligation or a responsibility that they have to keep, which means that just like a contract can be breached, a covenant could be breached, right? Okay, depends on who is responsible to do what part of it. But it is formal, it is legal, and it is binding. A formal legal agreement made between at least two parties. Now, there are a lot of covenants in the Bible, a lot of contracts in the Bible. Abraham made a covenant or a contract to to purchase a piece of land. Okay, well, that one's not theologically significant today. It is, but today, for our purposes, it's not theologically significant. We're going to be focusing on 6 covenants that were all made. The two parties were God and someone else. Okay, God initiated each of these covenants, and he made them with one or more people. It could be a group of people, it could be one individual person, but all the ones that we're going to be looking at are ones that God initiated. By the way, let's go back to the formal legal agreement for just a second. How do we formalize contracts today? What is the thing that in almost every case, what has to happen in order to make it legally binding? You got to sign it, right? There's got to be a signature. And usually whoever has responsibilities, sometimes even just beneficiaries, but whoever has the responsibility has to sign it, right? All of the 6 covenants that we're going to look at are going to be one of two kinds. They'll either have a signature, and by a signature we could mean some kind of sign or symbol. But not all covenants or contracts in history have required signatures. I'll bet you have done a covenant or a contract with somebody where it was specific, there was no signatures, it was just a handshake, right? Okay, you didn't have to draw up paperwork. You said, you know what, I'll do this, and the other person said, that's fine, and I'll do this. You're like, do we need to sign on it? Nah, just shake my hand. And that's our signature, right? Well, interestingly, that was true with some of the covenants throughout history as well, and some of the covenants that we'll see didn't require big signs and big symbols and big signatures. Some of them, as we'll see, are what I just called, they were handshake covenants. The third one is at least one party has a responsibility or an obligation. Now, if we're going to use 2 different words. We're going to use the term conditional or unconditional, okay? Conditional means, or the way we understand a conditional covenant says, if you do this, then I'll do this. Makes sense, right? There are conditions attached to it, which means that if the second party, the party that has the responsibility, does not fulfill their end of the bargain, the first side doesn't have to, right? If you, then I. If you don't, then I don't have to, or I won't. All right? Makes sense. It's logical. We do this stuff all the time. That's conditional. Unconditional is where one party says, I will. And that's the whole thing. I will do this. And so as we look through the 6 biblical covenants, we're going to see that, in fact, most of them are unconditional, and one of them is conditional, okay? So let's just do a very quick survey or a quick summary of our 6 biblical covenants. The first one is what we call the Noahic covenant because it was made with Noah. Okay, right in there. So that's how these work. So when we come across some of these other ones, you just lop off the ick at the end and you pretty much have the name. This is in Genesis chapter 9, and this is after the flood. God has released Noah and the animals and everything. And he says, I'm making this covenant, and here are the parties. There are 3 parties to this covenant. Between God and all humanity and all living creatures. Okay? Not just humanity. God has actually made a covenant with all people from Noah on, and with all animals and creatures from the ones who were on the ark on. So your little doggy at home has a covenant with God. Okay? Because God made this covenant with humanity and with all living creatures. The covenant is unconditional. This is an I will. Not if you will, then I will, but I will. This is what I'm going to do. God said, I will never again destroy the earth with a flood. And there's nothing that you and I can do to change that. There's nothing that your dog or cat can do to change that. Nothing in all of creation can change that. God said, this I will do. Period. So in this case, it is an unconditional covenant and only one party has a responsibility. Who can breach this covenant? If this covenant is going to be breached, who can do it? Who can break it? God is the only one because he's the only one who has a responsibility. Now, can God go back on his word? No, God can't go back on his word. God can't lie. And so if God says, this I will do, what should we expect? He will do. He will do every time. So we can be 100% confident that he is never going to destroy the earth again with a flood. This one did have a signature, and the signature is the rainbow. He said, I am placing this sign in the sky as my signature that I am going to do this. Okay, so we've got three parties. It's an unconditional covenant, and the signature is the rainbow. Cool so far? Makes sense? That's how all of these are going to work. All right? The second one is the Abrahamic covenant. Spoiler, it's with Abraham. Okay, so all right, we see this primarily in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, and this is one of the four we're actually going to get into a lot next session. But it's also in chapter 15, verses 9 through 21. The parties of this covenant are God and Abraham. Okay, now in this particular case, God told Abraham, I am going to fulfill it through a very specific one of your sons. How many sons did Abraham have? And now the song is in our head. Okay. How many biological immediate sons did Abraham have? He had more than two. These are the two that we remember is Ishmael and Isaac, right? But after Sarah died, he actually got married again to a woman named Keturah and had other sons. What's that? So he did have a lot of sons, and of course but God said, I'm going to fulfill this part of the covenant, or this covenant that I'm going to fulfill is going to actually go through Isaac only, not any of your other sons. And then to Isaac he said, I'm going to fulfill this only through one of your sons, Jacob, not Esau. And then to Jacob he said, I'm going to fulfill it through your 12 sons, who became the 12 patriarchs and the tribes of the nation of Israel. And so technically God and Abraham are the only parties, and yet God said, I'm fulfilling it through these specific people. This is also an unconditional covenant. God said, I will make you, Abraham, into a great nation. Not if you do something, then I will, but I am going to make you into a great nation. And this is really where our next session is going to unpack. So that's all I'm going to say about that here for now. It is unconditional. God has to make Abraham into a great nation. Now, the signature is really interesting because in chapter 12, Genesis chapter 12, there is no signature. There's no big sign. There's no symbol. It's really just a handshake. Hey, Abraham, I'm going to do this. And Abraham's like, okay, you're going to do it. But when we get to Genesis chapter 15, God does actually do a signature, and he had Abraham cut some animals in half, and that was one of the common ways of signing a covenant or contract back then. And he gave Abraham a vision as when he sort of formalized this. And so in this case, it sort of happened in two sections. First the handshake, and then the formal signature came later. But again, next session we'll unpack that a little bit more, or quite a bit more. The third covenant is the Mosaic covenant. And the parties, this is we find in Exodus chapters 19 through 24. And you really do have to read all of these chapters to get the entire thing. Okay, God starts the covenant with the people of Israel in chapter 19, but it's not until chapter 24 that he says, will you do this? And he gives them the out, and they don't take it. They say, all that the Lord has said we will do. And he's like, are you sure you want to go down this route with me? Yes. Okay. And we have the Mosaic covenant, which goes along with the Mosaic law. And so it is with God and national Israel. And we don't have time to get into all of this. We do get into it a little bit more in the book. But Israel, the salvation that we find in the Old Testament is primarily focused on national Israel, not individuals. I'm not saying that there is no individual salvation in the Old Testament. There is. But most of the context of the Old Testament is talking about Israel as a nation, not Israel as individual Jewish people. And so the parties are God and national Israel. This is a conditional covenant. And we don't have enough room on the slide to give all of the conditions. But basically, it was, if you obey my law, if you obey my commandments, then you will prosper in the land. I will put none of these diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians. You will not have famine. You will not have drought. You will be protected. And all these, I will be your God. You will be my people if you obey my law. If you don't, there will be famine, there will be drought, there will be sickness, there will be disease, there will be oppression, there will be invasion, and eventually, if you continue to disobey me, you will be exiled. I'll kick you out of the land. What happened to Israel? Yeah, part B, right? They didn't obey, and just like God cannot go back on the good things that he promises, he also cannot go back on the bad things that he promises. And he had to fulfill all of those things. And they were bad sickness and famine and exile and all those other things. The signature of the Mosaic covenant was the stone tablets. And he actually cut the stone tablets with the 10 commandments, and there weren't just 10 commandments, there were 613. There's just the big 10 on the tablets. And he had to cut it twice because Moses is the only person in all of history to break all the 10 commandments at one time. You know that, right? You know? I mean, how bad of a guy does this have to be to break them all at the same shot, right? So he threw them down, shattered them, and had to make more. But also, for the people to see, while Moses was on Mount Sinai, there was fire and thunder and lightning and all this stuff going on as God is saying, this is my covenant with you. Okay, this was more than just a handshake. This was, there were signatures that had to go on, and they sacrificed animals. From Israel's standpoint, they sacrificed animals, and there were all of these things going on. So that's the Mosaic covenant, conditional, only between God and national Israel. Then we move to one that we call the land covenant. Now, if you have an older study Bible, maybe it'll be called the Palestinian covenant. We don't prefer to use that terminology anymore because of geopolitical issues in the Middle East. Okay, we're talking about the land of Israel, not the land of Palestine. We believe it belongs to the nation of Israel, not the other countries represented by the Palestinian peoples. So we'll just call this the land covenant. And this is in Deuteronomy chapter 30. And again, the parties are God and national Israel. And this is also unconditional. And as we'll see in the next session, that God promises Israel what's his name? Abraham, and his descendants a very specific tract of land. And so Genesis 15 is the promise of the land, but Deuteronomy 30 promises the timing of the land. Now, you could look at Deuteronomy 30 and say, oh, it looks like it's conditional because if you obey, then I'll bring you back, and if you disobey, then I'll keep you out and everything. But the promise of the land had already been made. So Deuteronomy 30 just says, not if you obey me, but when you return to me, when you come back to me, then I will bring you back into this land. And it's a promise. And it's unconditional because they will turn back to him. He said they will turn back to him. As a nation, not individual. This in Deuteronomy chapter 30 is a handshake. Okay, no new signs, no new symbols. We have the signature in Genesis 15, but in Deuteronomy 30, I'm just calling it a handshake. God says, I'm going to do this. We skip forward about 400 years to the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 8 through 16. And the parties here are God making a covenant with David. So this is God in just one person. And the covenant was this: I will give you an eternal dynasty. Your dynasty, your royal family, your royal right to the throne will never end. Now, the promise is not there will always be somebody from David's line on the throne, but there will always be somebody from David's line available for the throne of David. And the throne of David is the royal line over Israel forever. Okay? And so that's unconditional. David couldn't do anything to make it happen or not make it happen or anything. It's all on God to do this. And this is also a handshake. David didn't have to make sacrifices or anything. God didn't throw a big sign in the sky. He just said, this I'm going to do. And the sixth covenant is the new covenant. And this is the one that we tend to be a little bit more familiar with because the verbiage shows up when we celebrate communion, because we remember that at the Last Supper, Jesus said, this is the new covenant in my blood. Well, the new covenant is actually in Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34, and that's the place that the phrase new covenant shows up. But we also see some of the details in Ezekiel chapter 36. The parties, it's really interesting, and we will get into this in the next session. I know I'm going very quickly here. But the parties here, again, are God and two other groups, the whole house of Israel and the whole house of Judah. And that takes a little bit of background, because by the time Jeremiah wrote, the nation of Israel had split into two kingdoms, north and south, or Israel and Judah. And so this promise that God was going to make a new covenant with the whole house of Israel and the whole house of Judah means, or we can foresee that they're going to come together into one group again, and not, somebody's going to be left out. Again, this is an unconditional promise. And it includes, if you look just at Jeremiah, it looks like it's only spiritual promises, but if you bring Ezekiel in, there are some physical promises there as well. And again, there's nothing that the whole house of Judah and the whole house of Israel have to do. God said, I will do this, and so it's unconditional. And this is what I'm calling a handshake. Again, no big signs in the sky. It was just God had these two prophets announce, this is what I'm going to do. And there's nothing that Israel had to do to make it happen, or that they can do to prevent it from happening. And so I'm calling this a handshake. Now, when it comes to this one specifically, there's a big debate going on right now of whether the church is connected with the new covenant in any way. Okay, and that has gone back and forth. It's not just right now. That's gone on for several decades at the very least. This may be one of those issues where Paul and Dave and I might disagree, and this may be a good question for the forum tomorrow, the question and answer forum, or during breaks or whatever. My personal feeling, and you can do with this what you want, my personal thought is that if we keep a complete and clear distinction between Israel and the church in all manners, like we've been talking about, and if this covenant is with the whole house of Israel and the whole house of Judah, I don't see the church anywhere in the covenant. Okay? And I don't see anything in the New Testament that says that the church has been brought into the new covenant. Okay? And so my personal feeling is that the new covenant, and especially because of the context of Jeremiah 31, is in those days after I plant them back in their land, I will make a new covenant with them. The context is the millennial kingdom. I don't see the church as being connected to the new covenant in any way. Now, some people do, and that's fine. Some people have thought in the past that there are two new covenants, one for Israel, one for the church, and this debate has gone on for a long, long time. It's just where I've happened to land, and we can talk about that later if you want. Okay? Now, 4 of these are yet not fulfilled. The Abrahamic covenant, land, Davidic, and if the way I see it, the new covenant, because it's in the millennium kingdom, these things are not yet fulfilled. And I think they all four of them connect to the kingdom. And that's what our next session is going to be about. So, any questions real quick on just the overview of the 6 covenants, the 6 biblical covenants? No? Great. I mean, you've got it perfectly, no problem. Yeah. No. Just kidding. The Noahic covenant?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, you're taking pictures. Good.
Oh, yeah. I just missed that.
Okay. Why write it all down if you can just take a picture, right? Yeah, good, good. Some people, yeah, some people.
Thank you.
Well, he has to update his website now because I said we're not part of the new covenant. He's like, oh, no, so I got to change it. So, yeah. Yeah, right, yeah. What's that?
You have a right to be wrong.
I do, but it's never happened yet, and I'm still waiting for one of those options. Okay, so there are 6, we see 6 biblical covenants. 4 of them haven't been fulfilled yet, at least in my estimation. So that's one way to survey the Bible, right? So you can see as we're moving through as God, and Dave said that when we're studying in context, make sure we're aware of where we are in the big picture, right? And he specifically used the term dispensations, and we'll do that next. But we also have to see, are we in covenant with God right now? If we are, which covenant are we in? Which one, applies to us and does not apply to us? Dispensations are different than covenants in that while the term covenant is used very regularly, the term dispensation is not used in Scripture quite as regularly, quite so much, okay? And we don't find all of the dispensations explicitly detailed like we do the covenants that we just looked at them. So, from the introductory session, I didn't put the quote back up again. A dispensation is simply how God manages the human world, okay? And I do say human world because if we included angels, God works with angels differently than he does humans, right? Okay, so we would have to come up with a new or a different scheme for how God manages angels than how God manages humans. And we'd have to come up with a different scheme of how God manages, creation, the animals, and everything as well. But what we're talking about is primarily how God administrates people. And administrates is really a good word. And I really like the term administration or management because of where this comes from. The Greek word is oikonomia. And you can tell that right there. And it shows up in a couple of places, and we'll look at a couple of those key verses. But where we get the word dispensation is actually from the Latin Bible. When Jerome was translating the Bible back in the 300-400s, when he was translating the Bible from Greek, let's say in the New Testament, into Latin, when he came across the word oikonomia in Greek, he translated it with the Latin word, or a form of the Latin word, dispensatio. Well, all you have to do is add an N to the end, and hey, we have dispensation, right? Well, again, what does dispensatio mean? What does oikonomia mean? It literally, oikonomia means house law or rules of the house. That's all the word means. Okay? It's an administration, it's a management, it's a stewardship of what's going on. And we see this word, oikonomia, 9 times in the New Testament. And we're going to look at 3 of those verses very specifically, very quickly as we go through these. This concept of administration or management or rules of the house is not limited to God. You and I do this all the time. Okay, this is exactly the same thing that we do with our children at home. Okay, when our children are young, we have very specific rules for them, right? Okay, Paul's got a 2-year-old son, Oliver. He has very specific rules for Oliver that I don't have for my 20-year-old or my 15 or my 17-year-old because they're different. right? And as Oliver grows up, and as my kids grew up, and as your kids, if they were young, they grew up, if you got kids, the rules changed, didn't they? They changed based on the house that you lived in or the time of year that you were in. Summer rules are a little bit different than winter rules when you're going to school. Maybe bedtimes are different. Even the time of year can change rules, right? Rules can be different for boys versus girls. Rules can be different for all sorts of different reasons. And as they grew and as you moved and as the year went on, the management style and the rules that you had on your children, they changed. And each time they changed, you let them know what the rules were so that everybody was on the same page, and then you administrated your family in that way. Not only that, but if you have enough kids with enough of an age span, you might actually have multiple administrations going on at the same time, right? Because your older children have this set of rules and your younger children have this set of rules, and you're still in charge, theoretically, right? So how many administrations can you have going on at the same time? Well, it depends on how many kids you are or you have and all sorts of different reasons. So this concept of ruling a house or administrating or managing a house, we're used to this. We do this all the time. What we have to do is we have to think that this is how God also manages the world. He manages humanity like his house, or like we would rule our house. And so different rules at different times based on different information and different all sorts of things. Now, traditionally, the most popular system is that there are 7 of these administrations, 7 of these dispensations throughout the course of history. And there are all sorts of different ways to look at those. If you picked up the little expandable accordion-looking thing over on Paul's table, it has one way of looking at the dispensations. There was information and a test and a failure and a judgment and all that, and that's one way to look at it. I look at it very, very differently, because I don't ask first how many dispensations are there. I ask, when did a dispensation change? And how do I know the dispensation changed? Well, I answer this with a very simple answer. A dispensation changes when God changes the rules. That's it. It's very simple. When God says, here's a new set of rules, that's a new dispensation. It's a new management. Okay, it's just a new way of ruling. Colossians 1:25, Paul says, of this church, I was made a minister according to the stewardship from God. Stewardship is oikonomia, and so the church is one way that God has managed this world. Okay, so we see the church as one of the dispensations. In Ephesians chapter 1, verse 10, we jump in the middle of a sentence, with a view to an administration, there is oikonomia, suitable to the fullness of the times. And so there's an administration that Paul calls the fullness of the times, and he describes it as when everything is summed up in Christ, the summing up of all things in Christ, the things in the heavens and the things on the earth. All right? Well, that hasn't happened yet, so we know that there's an administration or a management that has to happen in the future. Okay? Just a couple chapters later in Ephesians 3, again, we jump in the middle of a sentence, and to bring to light what is the administration, oikonomia, of the mystery which for ages has been hidden in God who created all things. Well, in this case, the mystery that has been hidden is the church again. So we already did the church dispensation. Well, yes, that's true. But if the church dispensation had been hidden in the past, that means that it had a start date, didn't it? Which means that there has to be at least one dispensation before the church. Right? Make sense? If the church is going on right now, but it didn't used to be going on, that means something else was going on. So there has to be at least 3. There has to be one before the church, one that is the church, and then one future to the church at some point, the fullness of the times. Other than that, the Bible does not clearly say how many there are. So we have to use whatever term you want to use, guess or make, educated hypotheticals or study and come up to a conclusion. And I came to a conclusion that there were 9. Okay? 9. Now again, if we disagree on this, this is fine, but here's how I did it. See how fast we can go through 9 dispensations. Number 1, I call free will or innocence. By the way, if you're familiar with the 7 dispensations, you have a Schofield Bible or whatever, I keep those same 7 and I just add 2. Okay? So, under free will or innocence, there was one law. This was in the Garden of Eden. This was not a covenant that God had with people. It was a law. Don't eat or else. Right? Sounds an awful lot like law to me. Don't eat or else. You will surely die. What did they do? They ate, and that administration ended. It was done. Okay? They failed. They broke the law, and God said, now I have to deal with you and all of humanity differently. And so this ended with the fall. So basically, dispensation 1 was Genesis 2 and half of 3. That's the whole dispensation. And I think that was very quick. Number 2, we went very quickly then into what we call conscience or moral conscience. And this is one of those areas where people tend to disagree with, does every dispensation have a start and an end, or can they overlap, or can they run concurrently? I think they can run concurrently. And so I say that this one is still in effect today. There are many unwritten laws. Romans 1 and 2 says that the law of God is written on people's hearts. After the fall, and we'll say before the flood, because that's when the next one we see show up, when God gave new revelation, new information, if you read in Genesis, say, 3, 4, 5, and 6, where's the law of God written down somewhere where we know what it is? It's not in there. And yet, they still knew that they were breaking God's laws. Somehow there were unwritten laws, at least that we don't have written. And today, the Apostle Paul still writes that Christians still have to live up to our own conscience. It is sin if you violate your conscience. Okay, and so I say that our conscience is still, I say that this administration, God still works with human beings with our conscience. Number 3 is human government. In Genesis chapter 9, and you'll notice that we've got the Noahic covenant happened at the same time. Not all dispensations line up with covenants, but some do. In Genesis chapter 9, not only did God make the covenant of the Noahic covenant, but he gave one new permission, one new command or law that is still in effect today. The new permission is, I did give you all green things to eat, now I give you all living things to eat as well. So before the flood, we were vegetarian or vegan or whatever you want to call it. After the flood, God said, now you can eat anything you want to. That's the permission. The new law was, if a wild animal or a wild person murders a human being, it is society's responsibility to put that wild animal or wild person to death. Capital punishment instituted by God. Genesis chapter 9, there were only 8 people. He gave the law to all 8 people, which constituted the entire human race at that time. He gave it to humanity, and he's never taken it away. Paul in Romans chapter 13, 1 Peter chapter 2, still encourages even believers to obey human and submit to human government. And so I would say that the dispensation of human government still is in effect today. Number 4, the Abrahamic promises in Genesis chapter 12. God gave new information, and he said, here's a new law. Bless Abraham and his descendants, and I will bless you, curse them, and I will curse you. That's new. That never happened before, and that has never been rescinded. If a nation treats Israel rightly, then that nation will be blessed. I think that's one of the reasons that America has continued to be blessed in some ways, because we still are allies with Israel. We have not turned our back on Israel. God hates anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is demonic, it's satanic. God says, if they bless you, I will bless them. If they curse you, I will curse them. That's a new law, it's new information. Number 5 is the Mosaic Law, or the Mosaic Covenant. Now, this was 613 new laws, and this was given only to the nation of Israel. Only to the nation of Israel. Never to any other nations, even those that were around Israel at this time. And this one ended with the cross. It had a very specific start date. With the covenant. It had a very specific end date, ended on the cross, and some people disagree with a little bit of that timing, but most of us agree that it happened around there, the cross or his resurrection or ascension or something. And so it is no longer in effect. Now, if you are not a Jewish person, it was never in effect for you. Okay? Even if it were still in effect today, it wouldn't be in effect for you. It wouldn't have any be binding on you in any way if you're not a Jew. It's only with the nation of Israel. All right? Number, whatever I'm on, 6. Is this 6? Church? 6? 1, 2, 3? Yes. 6 is the church. There are numerous rules. We call it the law of Christ. We call it the law of liberty. All sorts of things. But in this administration that God is working with us, we are empowered to live out these rules by the indwelling Holy Spirit. This is one of the distinctions between the church and every other dispensation. They did not have the indwelling Holy Spirit, and we're empowered to live out the law of Christ. The church is accessible, unlike nation of Israel, the church is accessible to anyone who believes. Everyone who believes during this time is added to the church automatically, immediately by the Holy Spirit, and it's only those who believe. The church age has a very distinct beginning and a very distinct end time, from Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 until the rapture. Okay, now the church will go on forever, just like the nation of Israel will go on forever, but the dispensation has a very specific start and stop time. Number 7 is the tribulation, or Daniel's 70th week. Daniel prophesied in Daniel chapter 9, the prophecy of 70 weeks, and there's one more week that has to happen. God is going to administer this world or manage this world in a way we've never seen before. He's never done before. There's going to be brand new revelation given according to Joel chapter 2, visions and dreams. They're going to see all new stuff, new revelation. And yet they'll still be under moral conscience like we are now, still under human government like we are now, still under Abrahamic promises like we are now. Okay, those will not have ended yet. But God will still be administrating the world. He's going to use holy angels, demons as his agents. He's going to use Satan as one of his agents to administrate the world during that time. He'll use the Antichrist. He'll use inanimate objects. He's going to use all sorts of things to manage the world during the tribulation. Okay? This one is a very short one. It lasts only 7 years. It'll start after the rapture of the church, and it'll end when Jesus comes back. Okay? 2 more to go very quickly. Number 8. If you need to get these down, I can give them to you during the break. The millennial kingdom. The millennial kingdom. This is a completely different administration, a way of managing the world than we've ever had before. This will be a theocracy, which means it is God's rule. God will be ruling himself. He'll be doing this through Jesus. Jesus' word will be law. He will be king of the world. What he says is the law, period. The Old Testament tells us, many prophecies tell us that he's going to rule with an iron fist. That's the way we say it. The Hebrew says a rod of iron, but same idea. Why would you need to do that if there's not going to be rebellion, right? If there's not going to be people breaking the law, why would you have to have a rod of iron or iron fist? There will be animal sacrifices during the millennial kingdom. Rebels who are blatantly rebels, they'll be executed during the millennial kingdom. So this is a management that has not happened, or a way that God has not managed the world before. At least human government and the Abrahamic promises will continue through this. There's some question over whether the conscience will be part of it. It probably will. But the church age will be done. The tribulation will be done. And this is 1,000 years from the time Jesus comes back. Shortly after his second coming, he sets up his kingdom, which lasts for 1,000 years. And then number 9. The fullness of the times. I keep this as a separate one because I see the fullness of the times, or the eternal state that Paul talked about in Ephesians 1:10, as separate from the millennial kingdom. I think the millennial kingdom sets up the rest of it, but in the millennial kingdom, you don't have all things summed up into Christ yet, things in heaven and things on earth. There's still stuff that has to happen. It's not until we get to the eternal state that everything is summed up in Christ, the way Paul described it in Ephesians chapter 1. Now, in the eternal state, there won't be any law necessary because we'll all be fixed in our permanent spiritual states. Those who are believers of all time, all the saints of all the ages will be in God's presence eternally. All unbelievers of all time will be in the lake of fire eternally, separated from God. And all of the other dispensations will be summed up here. This one starts at a very specific time, and it lasts forever. Okay, so that is a very, very quick, obviously, survey of the dispensations and the covenants. It's one way to do it. We could get so much more detailed, and in the book we do get more detailed, and you can ask questions of any of us as well. So when we need to make sure that when we study the scriptures, whatever we're studying connects back to that big storyline so that we don't get lost, so that we don't misinterpret and misapply things in the Bible to us or to someone else when they were never intended for us or for someone else. We have to make sure that we stay within the big storyline.